There are places in America where the past refuses to stay buried. Hollow Creek, Montana, is one of them. And on a cold October morning in 2024, when contractor Mike Dalton pushed open the heavy oak doors of the abandoned Hollow Creek School for the first time in over a century, he had no idea he was about to stumble into the darkest chapter of his town's forgotten history. What he found inside those 24 desks would shatter everything the community thought they knew about themselves. The wind cut through the valley that morning, carrying with it the scent of pine and decay. Mike had been hired by the Hollow Creek Historical Society to assess the structural integrity of the old schoolhouse before its planned conversion into a museum. The building stood isolated, 3 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by overgrown grass and the skeletal remains of what had once been a playground. The wood siding had weathered to a ghostly grey, and several windows were cracked or missing entirely. But the structure itself seemed solid, almost defiant in its refusal to collapse after all these years. Mike's boots echoed on the wooden steps as he approached the entrance. The padlock that had secured the doors for decades had been removed the previous week by the county, leaving only rust stains on the weathered wood. He gripped the iron handle and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, but the door gave way, releasing a gust of stale air that made him step back and cough. Inside, the single large room was dim, illuminated only by the weak morning light filtering through dirty windows. Dust particles danced in the pale beams, and the floorboards groaned beneath his weight as he stepped across the threshold. Mike pulled out his flashlight and swept it across the interior. The beam revealed rows of small wooden desks, arranged in neat lines just as they must have been on the last day of class in 1910. A blackboard still hung on the far wall, its surface covered in a film of dust so thick that any writing had long since disappeared. He moved slowly down the center aisle, his flashlight beam moving from desk to desk, noting the water damage on the ceiling, the buckled floorboards near the windows, the way the entire structure seemed to lean slightly to the east. He was mentally calculating repair costs, thinking about foundation work and roof replacement, when his light fell on the first desk in the second row. Mike stopped walking. His brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. There, centered perfectly on the desktop, rested a small human skull. The bone had yellowed with age, and the empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly at him. His first instinct was to look away, to convince himself he'd imagined it. But when he forced his gaze back, the skull remained, undeniably real. His hands began to shake. The flashlight beam wavered as he moved it to the next desk. Another skull, and the next. Another. His breathing became shallow and rapid as he swept the light across the entire room. Every single desk, all 24 of them, held a child-sized skull, each one positioned with disturbing precision in the center of the writing surface. Mike's phone was in his hand before he consciously decided to reach for it, but there was no signal out here. There never was. He backed toward the door, unable to take his eyes off the macabre display. His mind raced through possibilities. A sick prank. But who would do this, and how would they even obtain human remains? The building had been sealed for over 100 years. The Historical Society's records were clear about that. After the school closed in 1910, the doors had been locked and never officially reopened. He needed to get back to town. He needed to call the sheriff. Mike turned and practically ran out of the building, leaving the door standing open behind him. His truck was parked a quarter-mile away on the old logging road. He covered the distance at a near sprint, his breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the horror of what he'd just witnessed. 30 minutes later, Sheriff Carol Henderson's patrol car was bouncing down the same rutted logging road, Mike's truck following close behind. Carol had been sheriff of Hollow Creek County for 12 years, and in that time she'd dealt with everything from domestic disputes to methamphetamine labs hidden in the forest. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what Mike described on the phone. "You're absolutely certain?" she asked as they parked and began the walk to the schoolhouse. "Human skulls, not animal bones, not Halloween decorations?" "I know what I saw, Carol," Mike said. His face was pale and his hands still trembled slightly. "They're real. And they're children." The sheriff said nothing more as they approached the building. The open door yawned before them like a mouth. She pulled out her own flashlight and entered first, her hand resting instinctively on her service weapon. Mike followed reluctantly, staying close to her side. The skulls were exactly as he'd described. Carol moved slowly through the room, examining each one without touching anything. Her law enforcement training kicked in automatically. This was a crime scene, potentially one of the worst she'd ever encountered. She pulled out her phone to take photographs, the camera flash illuminating the room in harsh bursts of white light that made the shadows seem even deeper. "We need to seal this building immediately," she said, her voice steady despite the horror of the situation. "And I'm calling the state police. This is beyond anything we can handle locally." She paused at the teacher's desk at the front of the room, where a leather-bound book lay open, its pages brittle with age. She leaned closer, careful not to touch it, and read the faded handwriting on the visible page. Her expression changed. "Mike, come look at this." He approached reluctantly. The book appeared to be an attendance register, with names listed in neat rows, dates running across the top. But it was the final entry that caught their attention. The date read November 7th, 1910, and beside each of the 24 names was a single word, written in the same careful handwriting, but with heavier pressure, as if the writer's hand had been shaking. Absent. Every single child had been marked absent on what appeared to be the school's final day. Within 2 hours, the Hollow Creek School was surrounded by yellow crime scene tape, and the gravel parking area that had been empty for decades was now crowded with vehicles. Montana State Police forensic investigators moved carefully through the building, photographing and documenting every detail. A mobile command center had been set up in the clearing, and Sheriff Henderson found herself coordinating with investigators who specialized in historical crimes and cold cases. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Montana, arrived by helicopter just before noon. She was a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades working with human remains. Carol watched as Dr. Warren entered the schoolhouse, her face impassive as she surveyed the scene that had shaken everyone else to their core. "The preservation is remarkable," Dr. Warren said, kneeling beside the first desk to examine the skull without touching it. "These have been kept in stable conditions for a very long time. No exposure to the elements, minimal temperature fluctuation." She stood and moved systematically from desk to desk, making observations into a small recording device she carried. All appear to be juvenile remains, approximately ages 6 through 12 based on dental development and cranial suture patterns. I'll need to examine them properly in the lab, but preliminary observation suggests they've been here for many decades, possibly since the building was sealed. "That's impossible," Mike said from where he stood near the doorway, unable to bring himself to enter the room again. "The school closed in 1910. Are you saying these skulls have been sitting here for over 100 years? Dr. Warren turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm saying it's possible. The conditions in this building would have allowed for that kind of preservation. But the real question isn't how long they've been here. The question is where the rest of the skeletal remains are, and how they came to be arranged this way." That question hung in the air as the investigation continued throughout the afternoon. Teams of investigators carefully searched every inch of the schoolhouse, looking for any additional remains, any clues that might explain the horrific display. They found nothing. No other bones, no hidden compartments, no signs of recent entry. The building had been sealed, just as the records indicated, and there was no evidence that anyone had entered it between 1910 and the morning Mike Dalton opened the doors. By evening, the story had broken. News vans from Billings, and even as far as Seattle, had begun arriving, their satellite dishes turning the quiet valley into a media circus. Carol found herself giving statement after statement, saying as little as possible while the investigation was ongoing. But the questions kept coming, each one more sensational than the last. Were the children murdered? Was this a mass grave? Had there been some kind of tragedy in 1910 that the community covered up? In town, the discovery sent shockwaves through the population of 3,000 residents. Hollow Creek had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where families had lived for generations. The oldest residents could trace their lineage back to the founding families of the 1880s, when copper mining had briefly brought prosperity to the valley. But no one, not even the oldest among them, had ever heard stories about missing children or a tragedy at the school. Margaret Chen, the president of the Hollow Creek Historical Society, sat in her small office above the town library. Surrounded by boxes of documents and photographs she'd been frantically searching through since Carol called her that morning. Margaret was 73, a retired librarian who had dedicated the last 20 years of her life to preserving the town's history. She knew the records better than anyone, and what she was finding deeply disturbed her. "There's a gap," she said when Carol stopped by that evening. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she held up a leather-bound ledger. "The town council minutes from 1910. They just stop. The last entry is from October 15th of that year. The next entry isn't until January of 1911, and it's in different handwriting. A new clerk. But there's no explanation for the gap, no transition, nothing." Carol leaned over the desk to look at the ledger. "What about school records, attendance, enrollment, anything like that?" "That's what's strange," Margaret said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "The school district records from that period are missing. Not lost, not damaged, deliberately removed. There are gaps in the filing system where they should be. Someone took them out, probably decades ago. But I did find this." She pulled out a yellowed newspaper, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. "The Hollow Creek Gazette, November 1910. Look at page 3. The newspaper was fragile, its print faded but still legible. Carol read the short article Margaret pointed to. "Local school closes unexpectedly. The Hollow Creek Primary School has closed its doors effective immediately due to circumstances beyond the district's control. Students will be accommodated in alternative arrangements. Families seeking information should contact the superintendent's office." That was all. No explanation, no details, nothing to indicate what had happened. "There should be more," Margaret said, her voice tight with frustration. "Something this significant should have generated multiple articles, town meetings, records, but it's like someone went through and systematically removed every reference to whatever happened. And look at this." She pulled out a census record from 1910. 24 children were enrolled in that school at the beginning of the school year. By the 1920 census, none of those names appear, not one. 24 children simply vanished from the records. Carol felt a chill run down her spine. Entire families moved away. "That's what I thought at first," Margaret said. "People moved around a lot back then, especially in mining towns when the work dried up. But here's what doesn't make sense. Many of the parents' names are still there in the 1920 census. Same people, same town, but their children are just gone. It's as if they never existed." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the implications of what Margaret had found settling over them like a dark cloud. Outside, the streetlights were coming on, casting pools of yellow light on the quiet main street. Hollow Creek looked peaceful, unchanged, the same as it had for over a century. But something terrible had happened here, something that an entire community had worked to erase from memory. Carol's radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we've got something at the school. You need to see this." It was one of the state police investigators, and there was an urgency in his voice that made Carol's pulse quicken. She drove back to the school through the darkness, her headlights cutting through the forest as she followed the winding road up the valley. The scene was illuminated by portable floodlights now, turning the old building into an island of harsh white light in the surrounding blackness. Dr. Warren met her at the door. "We've been examining the skulls more closely," the anthropologist said, leading Carol back inside. "There's something you need to understand about them. They're not just old, they've been professionally prepared. Look." She directed Carol's attention to one of the skulls, pointing to the base where the spine would have connected. "See how clean these cuts are? This wasn't natural decomposition or even crude dismemberment. These skulls were carefully separated from the bodies and then cleaned and preserved using techniques that were standard in medical and academic settings of that era. Someone with anatomical knowledge did this work." "Like a doctor?" Carol asked, her mouth suddenly dry. "Or someone with medical training, yes," Dr. Warren confirmed. "And there's more. We found markings on several of the skulls, here and here. She indicated small numbers carved into the bone at the base of each skull. They're numbered 1 through 24. This wasn't random. Someone organized this, catalogued it. These children were treated like specimens. The next morning brought no relief from the nightmare that had descended on Hollow Creek. If anything, the revelation about the professionally prepared skulls made everything worse. The question that had kept Carol awake all night was simple but terrible. Who in 1910 would have had the knowledge and tools to do this, and why? She sat in her office at dawn, coffee cooling on her desk, scrolling through the preliminary forensic reports that Dr. Warren had emailed overnight. The anthropologist had worked through the night, conducting initial examinations of all 24 skulls. Her findings painted a picture that was both clinical and heartbreaking. The children had been between the ages of 6 and 13, 11 girls, 13 boys based on cranial morphology. Several showed signs of malnutrition common to children of that era and socio-economic status. 2 had evidence of healed fractures. All had died somewhere between 1900 and 1915, which aligned with the school's closure, but cause of death was impossible to determine from skulls alone. Dr. Warren needed the rest of the skeletal remains, and those were nowhere to be found. The state police had brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment and were scanning the area around the schoolhouse, looking for burial sites, but so far they'd found nothing. It was as if 24 children had been reduced to their skulls, and nothing more. Carol's desk phone rang, jarring her from her dark thoughts. It was Margaret Chen, and the older woman's voice was breathless with excitement and dread. "I found something. You need to come to the library right now." 15 minutes later, Carol was climbing the stairs to Margaret's office. The Historical Society president had clearly not slept either. Her silver hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under her eyes, but those eyes blazed with the intensity of discovery. "I've been going through property records," Margaret said without preamble, spreading documents across her desk, "looking for anything connected to the school or that time period, and I found this, a deed transfer from November 1910, right after the school closed." She tapped a faded document with her finger. The schoolhouse and the land it sat on were transferred from the school district to a private individual, Dr. Jonathan Ashford. The name meant nothing to Carol. Who was he? Margaret pulled out a photograph, an old portrait of a stern-looking man in his 40s with dark hair and a precisely trimmed beard. He was Hollow Creek's only physician from 1905 until 1912. Came here from Boston, supposedly for his health. The mountain air was supposed to be good for consumption patients. He set up practice in town and became quite prominent in the community. The mayor at the time was his patient. The mine owners, the wealthy families, they all went to him. "And the school district just gave him the schoolhouse?" Carol asked, her investigator's instincts immediately suspicious. "Not gave," Margaret corrected. "Sold, for $1, which was the standard way to transfer property to a trusted party back then. But look at the date, November 10th, 1910. 3 days after the school closed, and here's the interesting part. She pulled out another document, this one a land survey. The property was supposed to revert back to the school district after 20 years in 1930, but that never happened because Dr. Ashford disappeared in 1912. Just vanished one night. His house was found empty, his belongings still there, his medical practice abandoned. No one ever saw him again." Carol studied the photograph of Dr. Ashford, trying to read something in those stern Victorian features. "So we have a doctor with anatomical training who gained control of the schoolhouse right after it mysteriously closed, and who then disappeared 2 years later." "There's more," Margaret said quietly. She pulled out a newspaper clipping, this one from 1912. The headline read, "Local Physician's Disappearance Raises Questions." Carol read the brief article, which mentioned that Dr. Ashford had been under investigation by the Territorial Medical Board for unspecified ethical violations in the months before his disappearance. The investigation had been dropped after he vanished, the records sealed. "I've spent the last 3 hours trying to find those medical board records," Margaret said. "They're gone, destroyed in a fire at the Territorial Archives in 1923. Convenient, isn't it?" Carol pulled out her phone and called Dr. Warren. "I need you to look at something," she said. "The numbers on the skulls, how precise are they? Could they be dates?" There was a pause as the anthropologist considered. "They're just sequential numbers, 1 through 24, but let me look at my notes again." Carol could hear papers rustling. "Wait, you might be onto something. The numbers aren't engraved randomly. They're all positioned at exactly the same angle and depth. Very precise, very deliberate, like catalogue numbers." "That's what I thought," Carol said. "What if they're specimen numbers from a medical collection?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Oh, God," Dr. Warren finally said. "You think these were part of a private anatomical collection? That someone was keeping them as medical specimens?" "I think that's exactly what they were," Carol replied, looking at the stern face of Dr. Jonathan Ashford in the photograph. "And I think I know whose collection it was." By midday, the investigation had shifted focus entirely. A team of state investigators was now combing through every available record related to Dr. Ashford, his practice, and his 2 years in possession of the schoolhouse property. What they were uncovering painted a picture of a man who had been far more than just a small-town doctor. Detective James Morrison, the lead investigator from the state police, laid out what they'd learned so far in a briefing at the temporary command center. Dr. Jonathan Ashford was trained at Harvard Medical School, graduated in 1898, specialized in anatomy and pathology. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1904, he was quietly dismissed from his position as an anatomy instructor at Harvard. The official reason was personal health concerns, but I spoke to a historian at the medical school this morning. Off the record, there were allegations that he'd been obtaining cadavers through questionable means. "Body snatching?" Carol asked. "Nothing that could be proven," Morrison said. "But enough suspicion that the school wanted him gone. He moved west, ended up here in Hollow Creek. As far as we can tell, he practiced legitimate medicine for about 5 years. But then something changed in 1910. "The school closed," Margaret said. "The school closed," Morrison agreed. "And somehow Dr. Ashford ended up in possession of the building. Now, I've been looking into what happened at that school in the fall of 1910, and here's what I've found. Nothing. Absolutely nothing in any official record. But I did track down something interesting." He held up a photocopy of a letter, the original so faded it was barely legible. "This was in the private papers of the territorial governor, filed away and forgotten. It's from the mayor of Hollow Creek, dated November 1910, requesting assistance with what he calls a medical crisis of unprecedented nature." "What kind of medical crisis?" Carol asked. "It doesn't say. The letter is vague, almost deliberately so, but it mentions Dr. Ashford multiple times, always in the context of helping to manage the situation. And here's the thing. There's no record of any response from the governor's office. Either the response was lost, or the governor decided not to get involved in whatever was happening here." Carol stood and walked to the window of the command center, looking out at the schoolhouse in the distance. "So here's what I think happened," she said slowly, piecing it together. "There was some kind of outbreak or epidemic at the school. Maybe flu, maybe something else. Diseases killed children all the time back then. Multiple children died, probably quickly, possibly all around the same time. The town panicked." "And Dr. Ashford offered a solution," Margaret added, seeing where Carol was going. "He was the medical authority. Whatever he said about how to handle the bodies, the town would have listened. But instead of proper burials," Morrison continued, "he kept them, prepared the skulls like medical specimens. Maybe he claimed it was for research, to understand the disease. Maybe he just wanted them for his private collection, and the town let him do it because they were terrified and desperate. Then he sealed them in the schoolhouse," Dr. Warren said over the speakerphone, "locked them away with his secret. But why display them on the desks? Why that specific arrangement?" That was the question no one could answer. The psychological motivation behind placing each skull on a child's desk, creating a macabre phantom classroom, was something that went beyond medical collection or scientific curiosity. It spoke to something darker in Dr. Ashford's psychology, something that had turned him from a questionable medical practitioner into something far worse. As the sun set on the second day of the investigation, Carol found herself back at the schoolhouse, standing in the doorway and looking at the empty desks. The skulls had been removed, carefully packed and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for further analysis, but their presence lingered, a weight in the air that Carol could feel pressing down on her shoulders. "We're going to identify them," Dr. Warren said, coming to stand beside her. "DNA analysis, comparison with any genealogical records we can find. Those children deserve their names back. Their families deserve to know what happened to them." Carol nodded, but she was thinking about the other question that haunted her. What had happened to the rest of the remains? Where had Dr. Ashford disposed of them after he prepared the skulls? And what had ultimately happened to him when he disappeared in 1912? The answers to those questions would have to wait for another day. But as Carol locked the schoolhouse door and headed back to her car, she knew with absolute certainty that they would find answers. The past had been buried in Hollow Creek for over a century, but now it was coming to light, and nothing would stop the truth from emerging, no matter how terrible it might be. Dr. Warren's laboratory at the University of Montana became the nerve center of the investigation over the following week. The 24 skulls were laid out on examination tables, each one photographed, measured, and analyzed with every tool modern forensic science could provide. The anthropologist worked alongside a team of specialists, odontologists who examined the teeth, radiologists who conducted CT scans, and geneticists who carefully extracted samples for DNA analysis. Carol made the 3-hour drive to Missoula every other day, needing to see the progress, needing to feel like they were moving forward. On her third visit, Dr. Warren called her into a small conference room where she'd set up a presentation on her computer screen. "We've made some significant discoveries," the anthropologist said, pulling up a series of images. "First, the dental analysis has given us better age estimates and some potential identifiers. Several of the children had dental work, fillings, extractions. That was less common in rural areas in 1910, which suggests their families had some means. We are comparing those dental patterns against any records we can find." She clicked to the next slide, which showed microscopic images of bone tissue. "Second, we found evidence of malnutrition in most of the remains, but also something else: heavy metal exposure. Specifically high levels of copper and arsenic. Those were common contaminants in mining towns. So it's not surprising given Hollow Creek's history, but the levels we're seeing are significant." "Could that have killed them?" Carol asked. "Chronic heavy metal poisoning? It's possible, especially in children. But here's what's really interesting." Dr. Warren pulled up another set of images, these showing thin sections of bone under high magnification. "I found traces of a chemical compound on several of the skulls, particularly around the foramen magnum. That's the opening at the base where the spine connects. It's a preservative, formaldehyde-based, consistent with embalming and anatomical preparation techniques from that era." "So Ashford definitely prepared these himself," Carol said. "Almost certainly. And he used professional techniques. These weren't crude preparations. They were done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Dr. Warren paused, choosing her words carefully. "Carol, I've consulted with colleagues who specialize in the history of medicine. What we're seeing here is consistent with anatomical specimens from teaching collections. Medical schools used to maintain large collections of human skeletal material for instruction. The way these skulls were prepared, numbered and preserved, it's exactly how such specimens would have been treated. Except these weren't purchased from anatomical suppliers or taken from donated bodies," Carol said bitterly. "These were children from his own community." "Yes, and that brings me to what we found this morning." Dr. Warren's expression grew even more grave. "The DNA analysis has started producing results. We're comparing the samples against genealogical databases, and we've already gotten 3 preliminary matches. 3 of these children have living descendants in the Hollow Creek area." Carol felt her stomach drop. "Who?" Dr. Warren handed her a sheet of paper with 3 names. Carol recognized 2 of them immediately, long-time Hollow Creek families, people she saw around town every day. The third name was unfamiliar, but a quick check showed they'd moved to Billings in the 1990s. "We need to notify them," Carol said. "They deserve to know." "There's something else," Dr. Warren said quietly. One of the DNA samples showed something unexpected. Skull number 7, a girl approximately 9 years old at time of death. Her DNA shows she was closely related to Dr. Jonathan Ashford himself. Based on the genetic markers, she was most likely his daughter. The revelation hit Carol like a physical blow. His daughter. "We don't have any records of Ashford having children, Doctor," Warren said. "But the DNA doesn't lie. This child was his direct descendant, and she died along with the others." Carol drove back to Hollow Creek in a daze, her mind reeling. Whatever had happened at that school in 1910, it had taken Dr. Ashford's own child along with the others. That changed everything. Was he a monster who included his own daughter in some twisted collection? Or was there something else going on, something they still didn't understand? She went straight to Margaret Chen's office at the library. The Historical Society president had continued her own investigation, going through every scrap of available documentation from the period. When Carol told her about the DNA finding, Margaret sat back in her chair, her face pale. "I think I found something that might explain it," Margaret said. She pulled out a thin folder containing just a few pages. "I've been corresponding with archives across Montana, trying to find any references to Dr. Ashford or Hollow Creek in 1910. One of them sent me this. It's a death certificate from October 1910, filed in Butte, not here in Hollow Creek." Carol took the document and read it carefully. It was for a Mary Ashford, age 9, cause of death listed as typhoid fever. The father's name was listed as Jonathan Ashford, physician. The date of death was October 28, 1910. "Typhoid," Carol said softly. "That's what killed them. That's the epidemic." Margaret nodded. "I think it started with the children at the school. Typhoid outbreaks were common in that era, especially in places with poor sanitation or contaminated water. The school had a well. It's still there, though it's been capped for decades. If that well became contaminated, the children who drank from it during the school day would have been exposed." Carol pulled out her phone and called Detective Morrison. "We need to test the old well at the schoolhouse," she said. "I think it was the source of a typhoid outbreak." Morrison arranged for environmental health specialists to examine the site. Within 2 days, they had their answer. The well, though long dry, showed evidence of contamination from a failed septic system that had been installed nearby in 1909. The timeline matched perfectly. The children at Hollow Creek School had been drinking contaminated water every day they attended class. "Typhoid fever has an incubation period of 1 to 3 weeks, Dr. Warren explained when Carol called to share the findings. If multiple children were exposed at the same time, they could have all become symptomatic within days of each other. In 1910, the mortality rate for typhoid in children was high, maybe 30 to 40%. If all 24 students were infected, we could expect 8 to 10 deaths, maybe more if they didn't receive proper treatment." "But we have 24 skulls," Carol pointed out. "That would mean all of them died." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Yes," Dr. Warren finally said. "That would be unusual unless—" "Unless what?" "Unless they were quarantined together and the infection spread through the group multiple times, or unless some of them died from other causes related to the outbreak. Dehydration, secondary infections. Typhoid is brutal, especially in children, and in a rural area with only one doctor, if Dr. Ashford couldn't control the outbreak." She trailed off, the implications clear. Carol thought about Dr. Ashford watching the children die one by one, including his own daughter, watching and being unable to save them despite all his medical training. The town's only physician, failing in the most fundamental way possible. "The guilt must have destroyed him," Carol said. "He closed the school, probably quarantined the children there to prevent the disease from spreading to the rest of the town, but they all died anyway. And then what? He prepared their remains as specimens? Why would he do that?" "Maybe it was his way of coping," Dr. Warren suggested, reducing the children to anatomical specimens, scientific objects instead of people he'd failed to save. Or maybe he genuinely thought he could learn something from studying them, understand the disease better. The line between dedication and obsession can be very thin, especially in the face of trauma. Margaret had another theory. When Carol returned to Hollow Creek and met with her again, the older woman shared documents she'd found from Dr. Ashford's correspondence with other physicians. "He was writing to colleagues about the outbreak," Margaret said, describing symptoms, asking for advice, and he kept detailed notes about each patient's progression of disease. I found references to these notes in the letters, though the actual medical records are lost. But here's what's interesting. He was treating this outbreak like a research opportunity. Even as the children were dying, he was documenting everything. "That's not unusual for physicians of that era," Carol said. "They learned by observation. Disease outbreaks were opportunities to study pathogens, develop treatments." "True," Margaret agreed. "But then look at this letter, dated November 1910, after the outbreak was over. He's writing to a colleague at Harvard, his alma mater. He says, 'I have preserved specimens from the unfortunate incident for future study. Perhaps in death, these young souls can contribute to medical knowledge in ways they could not in life.'" He's talking about the skulls, Carol. He prepared them as teaching specimens. "For what purpose?" Carol demanded. He wasn't teaching anymore. He was in the middle of nowhere, Montana. His career was essentially over. Why keep them? "I don't think he knew," Margaret said quietly. "I think he was a man trying to find meaning in a terrible tragedy. He failed to save those children, including his own daughter. So he preserved them, numbered them, catalogued them like they were still his students. Put them back at their desks. Maybe in his mind, they could still learn, still contribute, still matter." It was a disturbing thought, but it made a certain twisted sense. Dr. Jonathan Ashford, brilliant anatomist and failed physician, creating a classroom of the dead because he couldn't cope with what the living had lost. The DNA identification process continued, and within 3 weeks they had names for 16 of the 24 children. Dr. Warren's team worked with genealogists and historians, tracing family lines, comparing genetic markers against descendants who volunteered samples. Each identification was a victory and a heartbreak. Children who had been erased from history were being restored to memory. But the cost of that restoration was immense for the families involved. Carol attended the first notification meeting, watching as a woman in her 60s learned that one of the skulls belonged to her great-great-aunt, a child named Emma Whitfield, who had disappeared from family records after 1910. The woman wept, but she also seemed grateful to finally know what had happened, to be able to lay her ancestors' memory to rest properly after all these years. Similar scenes played out across Hollow Creek as more identifications were made. The community, which had lived in ignorance of this tragedy for over a century, now had to confront it directly. Town meetings were held, discussions about how to memorialize the children, debates about what to do with the schoolhouse itself. Some wanted it torn down, the site cleansed of its dark history. Others argued it should be preserved as a memorial, a reminder of what had happened so it would never be forgotten again. Through it all, Carol kept coming back to one question. What had happened to Dr. Jonathan Ashford? He disappeared in 1912, 2 years after the outbreak, leaving behind his practice, his home, and his macabre collection sealed in the schoolhouse. Had he run from guilt? Had he been forced out by a community that blamed him for the children's deaths? Or had something else happened to him? The answer, when it finally came, was more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. Detective Morrison received a call from a property researcher in Helena who had been tracking Dr. Ashford's movements after 1910. The researcher had found something unusual in mining company records from 1912. Dr. Jonathan Ashford had purchased a one-way train ticket to Seattle on March 3rd of that year, but passenger manifests showed he never boarded. His luggage had been loaded onto the train, but Ashford himself vanished somewhere between Hollow Creek and the station. Carol drove to the train depot location, now abandoned and overgrown. Local railroad historians helped her understand the route. The old line had run through treacherous mountain passes, and several accidents had occurred over the years, but there was no record of any incident in March 1912. Morrison's team began interviewing descendants of railroad workers from that era, searching for any family stories or legends that might explain what happened. What they discovered came from an unexpected source. An elderly man in Butte, 94 years old, recalled stories his grandfather had told him. The grandfather had been a railroad worker in 1912, and he'd spoken of a doctor who had been found dead near the tracks outside Hollow Creek. The body had been identified as Dr. Ashford, but the death was ruled a suicide. The man had apparently walked into the wilderness and succumbed to exposure. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the Hollow Creek Cemetery, his death barely noted in official records. Carol and Margaret searched the cemetery records and found it, a burial plot from March 1912, listed simply as unknown male, approximate age 45. The location matched the grandfather's description. With permission from the county, they exhumed the remains. Dr. Warren confirmed, through skeletal analysis and dental records, that it was indeed Dr. Jonathan Ashford. But the cause of death told a different story than suicide. The bones showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. Consistent with being struck with a heavy object, someone had killed Dr. Ashford and made it look like he died of exposure. The question was who and why. The investigation into Dr. Ashford's murder opened new questions about what had really happened in Hollow Creek in 1910 and 1912. Carol and Morrison began looking at who might have had motive to kill the doctor. The obvious answer was parents of the dead children, seeking revenge for their loss. But the evidence suggested something more calculated than a crime of passion. Margaret discovered correspondence between town officials from early 1912. The letters, hidden in private family papers, revealed that several prominent citizens had learned about the skulls in the schoolhouse. Dr. Ashford had apparently shown them to someone, possibly trying to justify his actions as medical research. The response had been horror and outrage. The town leaders had demanded he leave Hollow Creek immediately and never return. But Ashford had refused. According to one letter, he'd threatened to expose what he called the town's complicity in covering up the typhoid outbreak. He claimed officials had known about the contaminated well before the children fell ill, but had done nothing to protect them. This revelation would have destroyed the reputations of several powerful families and possibly led to criminal charges. The town leaders had faced an impossible choice: let Ashford ruin them with the truth or silence him permanently. The evidence suggested they chose the latter. Dr. Warren's analysis indicated Ashford had been killed by a blow to the head with a smooth, heavy object, possibly a rock from the nearby creek bed. The killer had then left his body in the wilderness, knowing it would be found eventually, but hoping the elements would obscure the true cause of death. The plan had worked for over a century. Ashford's death was attributed to suicide or accident. The skulls remained sealed in the schoolhouse, and the town's dark secret stayed buried. Until now. As the full story emerged, Hollow Creek faced a reckoning with its past. The DNA identifications continued, and by late November, all 24 children had been named. Their descendants, some of whom still lived in the area, gathered for a memorial service at the site of the old schoolhouse. It was a grey, cold day, fitting for the somber occasion. Dr. Warren stood before the assembled crowd and read each name aloud. Emma Whitfield, age 8, Thomas Chen, age 10, Sarah Morrison, age 7. The list went on, each name representing a life cut short by disease and then erased from history by shame and fear. As she spoke, volunteers placed wooden markers in the ground, creating a memorial garden where the schoolhouse playground had once been. Carol watched the faces in the crowd, seeing grief and anger mixed with something else: relief. The truth, however terrible, was better than the weight of unknown history. Several elderly residents approached her after the service, sharing stories they'd heard from grandparents about children who had disappeared from family records around 1910. Now those stories finally made sense. The question of what to do with Dr. Ashford's remains sparked debate. Some argued he should be excluded from the memorial, treated as the villain of the story. Others pointed out that he'd lost his daughter too, and that his actions, however disturbing, had come from grief and desperation. In the end, a separate marker was placed for him, apart from the children but within sight of the memorial. The inscription read simply, "Dr. Jonathan Ashford, 1867-1912, may he find the peace that eluded him in life." The investigation into his murder remained technically open, but everyone understood there would be no prosecution. The killers were long dead, their motives understood if not forgiven. 6 months after Mike Dalton first opened those schoolhouse doors, Hollow Creek had transformed. The old building had been carefully preserved and converted into a museum and educational center, telling the full story of the 1910 typhoid outbreak and its aftermath. School groups visited to learn about public health, the importance of sanitation, and how communities respond to tragedy. The 24 skulls, after completing their journey through forensic analysis, had been given proper burials in the memorial garden. Each child's descendant had been offered the chance to hold a private service, and most had chosen to do so. The DNA database created during the investigation had sparked interest from genealogists worldwide, leading to new connections between families who hadn't known they shared this tragic history. Carol stood in the museum on its opening day, watching visitors move quietly through the exhibits. One room displayed period medical equipment and explained how typhoid was treated in 1910. Another showed the history of water sanitation and how contaminated wells had caused outbreaks across rural America. A third room honored the children, with photographs when available and written histories compiled from family records. But it was the final room that affected people most deeply. It contained a replica of the schoolhouse interior as it had been found, with 24 empty desks arranged in rows. Above each desk hung a small frame containing a photograph or description of the child who had sat there. Visitors could walk among the desks, reading about each young life, understanding them as individuals rather than anonymous victims. Mike Dalton attended the opening, still shaken by his role in uncovering the tragedy, but also proud that the truth had finally emerged. "They deserved to be remembered," he said to Carol as they stood together in the memorial room. "All of them, even Dr. Ashford. They all deserved better than being forgotten." Carol nodded, thinking about how history gets written and rewritten, how truth can be buried but never truly dies. Hollow Creek would carry this story forward now, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of the costs of silence and the importance of facing difficult truths. The past had finally been brought into the light, and in that light, healing could begin. As she left the museum that evening, Carol looked back at the old schoolhouse, no longer a place of horror, but a place of memory and learning. The children of Hollow Creek School had been silent for over a century, but now their voices would be heard by every visitor who walked through those doors. Their story would not be forgotten again. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.